The August heat in Talladega County, Alabama, hung heavy like wet wool. Beneath the twisted branches of an ancient sycamore tree, a crowd of 40-some men gathered in a semicircle, their boots stirring red dust that clung to their sweat-soaked shirts. The afternoon sun bore down mercilessly, turning the small clearing into a furnace. Flies buzzed around the horses tied nearby, and somewhere in the distance, a mockingbird sang, oblivious to the human commerce taking place below. Auctioneer Milton Graves stood atop a makeshift platform constructed from old tobacco crates, his voice hoarse from hours of calling bids. He was a thin man with a pock-marked face and yellowed teeth, his grey waistcoat stained with tobacco juice. Behind him, chained to an iron post, stood 7 enslaved people awaiting their turn on the block. Their eyes held the hollow resignation of those who had learned not to hope. "Next lot," Graves called out, consulting his ledger with ink-stained fingers. "Female child, approximately 13 years, field or housework, healthy constitution." He gestured lazily toward the post. "Bring her up." 2 men unchained a girl from the line and led her onto the platform. "What are you thinking about this story? Your opinion is incredibly important to us. Please subscribe, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and let us know if you're enjoying this tale. We truly value your feedback. It helps us create better content for you." She moved slowly, her bare feet making no sound against the weathered wood. She wore a simple cotton shift, torn at the hem and bleached nearly colorless by sun and repeated washing. Her hair had been roughly cut short, and her thin arms hung at her sides like broken branches. But it was her face that made several men in the crowd exchange glances. She kept her eyes fixed firmly on the ground, her jaw set in a tight line that suggested she had learned early the cost of defiance. Her skin was light brown, dusted with freckles across her nose and cheekbones. There was a small scar above her upper lip, barely visible in the harsh sunlight. "Starting bid," Graves announced. $1. Silence. The crowd shifted restlessly. Several men turned away, losing interest. The girl was too old to be considered truly valuable as a house servant's child, too young and thin to be useful in the cotton fields. She was trapped in that unfortunate middle ground that made plantation owners reluctant to invest. 75 cents, Graves tried again, his voice betraying irritation. "Surely someone needs a girl for the kitchen." More silence. A man near the front spat tobacco juice into the dirt and shook his head. Another muttered something about bad stock and walked toward his horse. Graves's face reddened. A failed sale reflected poorly on his reputation. 50 cents, he barked. "Come now, gentlemen. She's young enough to train proper." The girl remained motionless, her breathing shallow. She seemed to have retreated somewhere deep inside herself, to a place where auctioneers' voices and strangers' eyes couldn't reach her. Her hands trembled slightly at her sides, the only outward sign of fear. 25 cents, Graves said, desperation creeping into his tone. "I'll take 25 cents for quick sale." Still nothing. Several men had already mounted their horses, ready to leave. The sun continued its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rust. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked twice and fell silent. Then from the very back of the dispersing crowd, a voice rang out clear and commanding. 13 cents! Every head turned. The men who had been leaving stopped in their tracks. Even Graves seemed momentarily stunned into silence, his mouth hanging open mid-sentence. Through the crowd, parting the men like Moses parting the sea, walked Elias Carter. He was a tall man in his late 40s, broad-shouldered and imposing, with thick, dark hair graying at the temples. He wore a fine linen suit despite the heat, a gold watch chain glinting at his vest. His boots were polished to a mirror shine, and he carried himself with the absolute confidence of a man who had never been told no in his entire life. His face was sun-weathered and stern, with deep lines carved around his mouth from years of frowning at the world beneath him. Elias Carter owned Rivermore Plantation, 3,000 acres of prime cotton land along the Coosa River. He was known throughout Talladega County as a shrewd businessman, a regular churchgoer and a harsh master who tolerated no disobedience from his enslaved workers. When Elias Carter spoke, people listened. 13 cents, he repeated, stepping to the front of the crowd. That's my bid. Graves recovered his composure, though confusion still flickered in his eyes. Mr. Carter, sir, with all respect, 13 cents is hardly— 13 cents is what I'm offering, Elias interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Unless someone cares to bid higher, he turned slowly, surveying the crowd with cold grey eyes. Not a single man met his gaze. They all knew better than to compete with Elias Carter over anything, much less over a girl worth less than a decent meal. Graves swallowed hard, glancing down at his ledger as if the numbers there might offer some guidance. Finally, he raised his gavel, his voice uncertain. 13 cents, then. Going once, going twice. He paused, giving one final opportunity for a higher bid that everyone knew wouldn't come. Sold! The gavel struck wood with a hollow crack that seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet clearing. Elias approached the platform with measured steps. He pulled a small leather pouch from his vest pocket, counted out 13 copper pennies, and dropped them one by one into Graves's sweating palm. The coins clinked together with a sound like chains rattling. The bill of sale, Elias said simply, extending his hand. Graves hurried to scribble out the document, his handwriting shaky. He thrust it toward Elias, eager to be done with this strange transaction. She's yours, Mr. Carter. May she serve you well. Elias took the paper without looking at it and folded it precisely into thirds before tucking it into his breast pocket. Then he turned his attention to the girl for the first time. She hadn't moved, hadn't looked up. Her breathing had become even shallower, her whole body rigid with tension. Come, Elias said quietly. It wasn't a request. The girl finally lifted her head. And in that moment, as her eyes met his, something passed between them, some unspoken recognition that made Elias's breath catch in his throat. Her eyes were grey, the same shade of grey as his own, the same unusual light grey that marked all the Carters. Passed down through 3 generations, the freckles across her nose formed the exact same pattern as his sister's had. The scar above her lip, he had a matching one barely visible now beneath his moustache, from a childhood accident with a broken bottle. For a long moment, Elias stood frozen, staring at this child he had just purchased for 13 cents. The crowd had dispersed, men mounting horses and driving wagons away in clouds of red dust. Graves was already calling forward the next lot, but Elias Carter couldn't move, couldn't look away from those grey eyes that reflected his own face back at him. The girl's lips moved, forming words so quiet they were almost lost beneath the auctioneer's voice, but Elias heard them. They cut through the afternoon heat, and the buzzing flies, and the distant mockingbird's song. "My name is Ruth," she whispered. "My mother was Lydia." The world tilted. Elias felt his knees weaken, felt the blood drain from his face. Lydia. That name was a ghost, a memory he had buried deep and tried to forget. Lydia, the field woman he had taken to his bed during his wife's long illness. Lydia, who had become pregnant and threatened to tell the whole county who the father was. Lydia, whom he had sold south to a brutal sugar plantation in Louisiana 7 years ago, disposing of his problem before it could destroy his reputation. He had never asked if the child was born, had never wanted to know, had assumed that even if it survived, it would be lost somewhere in the vast machinery of slavery, nameless and untraceable. But here she stood, his daughter, sold to him for 13 cents. "Come," he repeated, his voice hollow now. "We're going home." Ruth followed him to his carriage without another word. She climbed into the back where the enslaved servants rode, settling herself on the hard wooden bench with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to discomfort. Elias mounted to the driver's seat, taking the reins with hands that shook slightly. As the carriage rolled away from the auction site, Heading down the dusty road toward Rivermore Plantation, Elias glanced back once at the girl. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on nothing. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across her face, and in the fading light, she looked even more like him and like Lydia. The road stretched ahead, winding through cotton fields and pine forests. Spanish moss hung from the oak trees like grey ghosts, swaying gently in the breeze. The carriage wheels creaked rhythmically, and somewhere in the distance slaves sang as they worked the fields, their voices rising and falling in mournful harmony. Elias Carter had built his fortune on the backs of enslaved people. He had bought and sold human beings like livestock, had separated mothers from children and husbands from wives without a second thought. He attended church every Sunday and considered himself a righteous man, blessed by God with prosperity. But sitting in that carriage, heading home with his daughter riding in back like cargo he'd just purchased, Elias felt something he had never experienced before. He felt the weight of sin. And somewhere deep in his chest, in a place he didn't know still existed, something began to break. Rivermore Plantation sprawled across the bend of the Coosa River like a sleeping beast, its main house rising 3 stories above manicured gardens that seemed obscene in their beauty compared to the slave quarters beyond. White columns stretched toward the sky, and wide verandas wrapped around the entire structure, offering shade from the relentless Alabama sun. Behind the house, neat rows of outbuildings stood in perfect order. The kitchen house, the smokehouse, the carriage house, the overseer's cottage, and farther back, barely visible from the main house, the rough wooden cabins where 200 enslaved people lived in conditions that would make a stable seem luxurious. Elias brought the carriage to a stop in the circular drive, the wheels crunching on the crushed oyster shells that lined the path. He sat for a moment, hands still gripping the reins, staring at his home as if seeing it for the first time. The setting sun painted everything in shades of gold and crimson, making the white columns glow like bones. "Get down," he told Ruth, his voice rough. "Follow me." She climbed down from the carriage with careful movements, her bare feet touching the crushed shells gingerly. Elias led her not toward the main house, but around the side, toward the kitchen building where smoke rose from the chimney and the smell of cooking meat drifted on the evening air. The kitchen was a separate structure, as was common in plantation houses, to prevent fires and keep the heat away from the living quarters. Inside, 3 women worked preparing the evening meal. They looked up as Elias entered, surprise and fear flickering across their faces. It was unusual for the master to come to the kitchen. "Bessie," Elias said, addressing the oldest of the 3 women, a stout figure with grey-streaked hair wrapped in a faded blue headscarf. "This girl will work under you. Give her a place to sleep and find her proper clothing. She starts tomorrow." Bessie's eyes moved from Elias to Ruth, taking in the girl's threadbare shift and bare feet, the hollow look in her eyes. But Bessie had survived 30 years of slavery by keeping her thoughts to herself. She simply nodded. "Yes, sir, Master Carter." Elias turned to leave, then stopped. He looked back at Ruth one more time, his eyes searching her face as if trying to solve some impossible equation. "What did you say your name was?" "Ruth, sir," she answered quietly, her eyes on the floor. "Ruth," he repeated, tasting the name like unfamiliar food. Then more sharply, did Lydia speak of Rivermore?" Ruth's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "She spoke of many things, sir, before she died." The words landed like a physical blow. Elias's face went pale, and for a moment he seemed unable to breathe. "She's dead. 2 years passed, sir, in Louisiana. They worked her in the sugar fields until her back gave out. She died of fever in the sick house." Ruth's voice remained flat, emotionless, but her grey eyes, those damnable grey eyes, held something fierce and unforgiving. "She called your name at the end, asked God to forgive you." Elias opened his mouth, closed it again. The kitchen had gone deathly silent. The other women had stopped their work, though they kept their heads down, pretending not to listen to this exchange that could get them sold or whipped for simply being present. "That's—" Elias started, then stopped. "You will speak of this to no one. Do you understand? No one." "Yes, sir," Ruth said. "I understand what things should not be spoken." The barb was subtle but unmistakable. Elias felt it land, felt the shame rise hot in his throat. He turned abruptly and strode from the kitchen, his boots striking hard against the wooden steps. Behind him, he heard Bessie's gentle voice. "Come here, child. Let's get you fed." Elias walked quickly toward the main house, his heart pounding. The evening air had cooled slightly, carrying the scent of magnolia blossoms and river water. Fireflies were beginning to emerge, their lights flickering in the gathering dusk. Everything looked exactly as it always had, orderly, prosperous, beautiful. But Elias felt as if he were seeing it all through different eyes. Through Ruth's eyes, perhaps, through Lydia's eyes, as she had been dragged away 7 years ago, screaming and pleading, her pregnant belly just beginning to show. He had stood on this very veranda and watched the slave trader's wagon roll away, carrying her toward Louisiana and the brutal sugar plantations where enslaved people died by the dozens each harvest season. He had felt nothing but relief. One problem solved, his reputation intact, his wife none the wiser. Now Lydia was dead, and her daughter, his daughter, was here, bought for 13 cents at an auction where she had been deemed nearly worthless. Inside the house, Elias's wife Eleanor sat in the parlor doing needlework, her delicate hands moving the needle with practiced precision. She was a thin woman with pale skin and light brown hair going grey, her face lined with the chronic illness that had plagued her for years. She looked up as Elias entered, offering a wan smile. "You're back late from town," she observed. "Was the auction productive?" "Productive," Elias echoed, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "Yes. I purchased a girl for the kitchen. Bessie needed help." Eleanor nodded absently, returning to her needlework. "That's fine, dear. Whatever you think best." She trusted him completely, had always trusted him. During her years of illness, when she'd been confined to her bed for months at a time, unable to fulfill her wifely duties, she had never questioned where he went in the evenings, whom he spent time with. She had simply trusted that her good Christian husband would remain faithful. That trust felt like daggers now. Elias climbed the stairs to his study on the second floor, a large room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a massive oak desk. This was his sanctuary, the place where he conducted business and managed the complex operations of Rivermore. Account ledgers lined one shelf, chronicling decades of profit extracted from cotton and human bondage. He poured himself 3 fingers of whiskey from a crystal decanter and drank it in one swallow, welcoming the burn. Then he poured another and sat heavily in his leather chair, staring at nothing. The evening deepened into night. Below, in the kitchen building, Ruth ate her first meal at Rivermore. Cornbread and salt pork, more food than she had seen in days. While Bessie and the other women watched her with curious, pitying eyes, they asked no questions. They had learned long ago that some stories were too dangerous to know. Ruth slept that night in a small room off the kitchen, on a pallet of straw covered with a thin blanket. It was the first time in months she had slept under a roof. Through the single small window, she could see the main house rising against the starlit sky, its windows glowing with lamplight. In one of those windows, Elias Carter sat awake at his desk, a second bottle of whiskey open before him. He had pulled out his ledgers, finding the entry from 7 years ago. Sold, Lydia, age 24, field hand, to J. Morrison, agent for Louisiana plantations. Price, $750. $750. That's what he had gotten for disposing of his pregnant mistress. 13 cents. That's what it had cost him to buy back his own daughter, the arithmetic of damnation calculated in copper and shame. As the clock struck midnight, Elias finally stumbled to his bedroom, his head spinning from whiskey and guilt. Eleanor was already asleep, her breathing shallow and labored as always. He lay beside her in the darkness, staring at the canopy above their bed, and for the first time in his adult life, Elias Carter allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he had done, not just to Lydia, not just to Ruth, but to all of them. The 200 souls he owned, whose lives he controlled, whose families he separated and sold as casually as cattle whenever it suited his business interests. He had built everything on their backs. This house, his wealth, his position in society, all of it purchased with human suffering, justified with scripture and the law, sanctified by a society that told him he was righteous for succeeding at this bloody business. And now his sin had a face, grey eyes that mirrored his own, freckles arranged in a familiar pattern, a scar that matched his own. In the darkness, Elias Carter wept. He wept silently, his shoulders shaking, his hands pressed over his mouth to muffle the sounds. Eleanor slept on, oblivious. And in the kitchen house, Ruth lay awake on her pallet, staring at the ceiling, her small hands clenched into fists. She had not told Master Carter everything, had not told him how her mother had made her memorize his name, his plantation, every detail Lydia could remember, had not told him how her mother had made her promise, on her deathbed, to find her way back to Alabama somehow, to make him see what he had done. Ruth had kept that promise. Through 2 brutal years after her mother's death, through being sold 3 more times to increasingly cruel masters, through hunger and beatings and violations she was too young to fully understand, she had kept moving north, kept asking questions, kept searching. And when she had heard that Rivermore's master was attending an auction in Talladega County, she had done something desperate. She had stolen bread from her previous master's kitchen and been caught deliberately, knowing it would get her sold quickly and cheaply. She had made herself worthless, 13 cents worthless, and he had bought her. Now she was here, in her father's house, sleeping under his roof. He didn't know yet that she had planned this, didn't know that her mother's dying wish had been not forgiveness, but justice. Ruth closed her eyes and thought of her mother's face, of Lydia's last words, whispered in that stinking Louisiana sick house. Make him remember, child. Make him see what he's done. Make him pay. In the main house, Elias Carter finally fell into a restless sleep, his dreams haunted by grey eyes and ghosts made of Spanish moss and river water. The game had begun, though only one player knew they were playing, and the stakes were higher than 13 cents could ever measure. The routine of Rivermore Plantation began each day before dawn, when the plantation bell rang out across the fields, calling the enslaved workers to their labor. Ruth woke to that sound on her first morning, the deep iron clang echoing in her chest like a second heartbeat. Around her, Bessie and the other kitchen women were already stirring, moving in the pre-dawn darkness with the efficiency of long practice. "Up, child," Bessie said, not unkindly. "We start the fires at 4:30. Master Carter expects his breakfast precisely at 7. Ruth rose from her pallet, her muscles aching from months of poor sleep and hard travel. Bessie handed her a rough cotton dress, worn but clean, and a pair of shoes. Actual shoes, though they were too large and had holes in the soles. After weeks of walking barefoot, they felt like a luxury. The kitchen was a world unto itself, separate from the main house, but intimately connected to it. Everything that fed the Carter family passed through this building, prepared by hands that were never supposed to touch the plates from which white lips would eat. Ruth learned quickly that morning how to bank the fires just right, where the water bucket stood, which knives were sharpest, how to move quietly and efficiently so as not to draw attention. But she also learned the geography of power. From the kitchen windows, she could see the entire plantation laid out like a kingdom. The main house stood at the center, white and imposing. Beyond it, the cotton fields stretched to the horizon, already dotted with bent figures moving between the rows. To the east, the overseer's cottage where Samuel Pierce lived, a cruel man with a quick whip and quicker temper. And farther still, the slave quarters, 2 rows of rough cabins barely visible in the morning mist. At precisely 7 o'clock, Ruth carried her first meal up to the main house. Bessie had instructed her carefully. Enter through the back door. Place the tray on the sideboard in the dining room. Do not speak unless spoken to. Keep your eyes down. Leave quickly. Ruth climbed the steps to the back entrance, her heart pounding. The door opened into a hallway lined with portraits of Carter ancestors, stern-faced men and tight-lipped women staring down from ornate frames. The house smelled of beeswax and lavender, so different from the smoke and sweat of the kitchen. She entered the dining room to find Elias already seated at the head of a long mahogany table, reading a newspaper. Eleanor sat at the opposite end, picking delicately at a piece of toast. Neither looked up as Ruth set down the tray. Eggs, bacon, grits, biscuits, preserves. But as Ruth turned to leave, Elias's voice stopped her. "Wait." Ruth froze. Slowly she turned back, keeping her eyes lowered as instructed. Elias was staring at her, his newspaper forgotten on the table. In the morning light streaming through the tall windows, the resemblance between them was even more striking. Eleanor, focused on her breakfast, didn't notice. "What's your name again?" Elias asked, though Ruth knew he remembered perfectly well. "Ruth, sir." "Ruth," he repeated. "How old are you?" 13, sir, or thereabouts. My mother wasn't certain of the exact date. Eleanor glanced up briefly at this exchange, mild curiosity on her face. "She's very light-skinned," she observed. "Good for housework, though she needs feeding up. She's too thin." "Yes," Elias said quietly, his eyes never leaving Ruth's face. "Too thin." An uncomfortable silence stretched out. Ruth could feel Eleanor's gaze moving between them, some instinct perhaps sensing the tension, even if she couldn't identify its source. "That will be all," Elias finally said, his voice strained. Ruth left quickly, her hands trembling. Behind her she heard Eleanor say something about the quality of the grits and Elias's distracted response. She hurried down the hallway, through the back door, and didn't stop until she reached the kitchen. "You did well," Bessie said, watching her carefully. "Master Carter is particular about his breakfast, but he didn't send it back. That's good." Over the following days, a pattern emerged. Ruth worked in the kitchen, learning the rhythms of the household. She discovered that Eleanor Carter was kind in her way, if distant and preoccupied with her failing health, that the Carters' 2 grown sons had moved away years ago, building their own plantations in Mississippi, that Elias ran Rivermore with an iron hand, respected and feared in equal measure by the white community and utterly dreaded by the enslaved people who worked his fields. She also discovered that Elias was watching her, always watching. He found reasons to visit the kitchen house, something he had apparently never done before. He would claim he needed to speak with Bessie about menus or supplies, but his eyes always found Ruth, following her movements with an intensity that made the other women exchange worried glances. At night, Ruth could see the light in his study burning long past midnight. She imagined him up there, drinking his whiskey, wrestling with whatever demons had awakened when he looked into her grey eyes and saw himself reflected back. 2 weeks after her arrival, Ruth was sent to clean the study. It was early afternoon, and Elias had gone to inspect the cotton fields. Eleanor was napping, as she did every day after lunch. Ruth entered the study with a basket of cleaning supplies, taking in the room that was so clearly the center of Elias Carter's private world. The bookshelves drew her attention first. She had never learned to read, but she recognized a Bible among the volumes and what looked like account ledgers. She moved closer, running her fingers along the leather spines, and one ledger fell open. The pages were filled with names, dates, and prices. Her eyes, unable to decipher the words, could still recognize numbers. She saw hundreds of entries, each one representing a human life bought or sold. The arithmetic of slavery, meticulously recorded. "Can you read?" Ruth spun around. Elias stood in the doorway, so silent in his approach that she hadn't heard him. Her heart hammered in her chest. "No, sir," she answered truthfully. "My mother tried to teach me letters, but we had little time." Elias stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. Ruth's pulse quickened with fear. She was alone with him, the door closed, no witnesses. She had heard enough stories to know what that could mean. But Elias simply moved to his desk and sat heavily in his chair. He looked older than he had 2 weeks ago, the lines around his mouth deeper, shadows under his eyes. "Lydia tried to teach you," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir. She said education was freedom, even if only in the mind. Lydia was always clever," Elias said, and there was something in his voice that might have been admiration or regret. "Too clever for her own good. She didn't understand how things had to be." Ruth felt anger flare hot in her chest. "She understood perfectly, sir. She understood she was property. She understood that you could do whatever you wanted to her, and there was no law to stop you. She understood when you sold her away that it was because she had become inconvenient." The words were out before Ruth could stop them, reckless and dangerous. Slaves who spoke to masters like this were beaten or worse. But Ruth found she didn't care. Let him beat her, let him sell her again. At least he would have to look at what he'd done. Elias's face had gone white. "You shouldn't speak to me like that." "No, sir," Ruth agreed. "I shouldn't. Just like my mother shouldn't have been sold to Louisiana, just like she shouldn't have died in a sugar field, worked to death at 31 years old, just like I shouldn't have been sold 4 times before I was 13. Shouldn't. But here we are." Elias stood abruptly and Ruth tensed, ready for the blow, but it didn't come. Instead, he walked to the window, staring out at his cotton fields where hundreds of people labored under the hot sun. "I didn't know she was pregnant," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "When I sold her, I thought she was lying to try to stay here. Would it have mattered if you had known?" The question hung in the air between them. Elias turned from the window, and Ruth saw something in his face she hadn't expected. Genuine anguish. "I don't know," he admitted. "God help me, I don't know. I was afraid. My wife was ill. If the truth had come out, it would have destroyed everything. My reputation, my standing in the church, my business relationships, everything I had built. Everything you built on our backs," Ruth said quietly. "Everything bought with our suffering." Elias sank back into his chair, his head in his hands. For a long moment, neither spoke. Outside, the sounds of the plantation continued, distant voices, the crack of the overseer's whip, the endless rhythm of labor that powered this place. "Why did you bid on me?" Ruth asked suddenly. "At the auction. You could have let me be sold to anyone. Why 13 cents? Elias looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "I saw her in your face, Lydia. The moment you stepped onto that platform, I saw her, and I couldn't let you go to someone else, not without knowing." "Knowing what? If you were real, if this was God's punishment or my guilt manifesting, if I was losing my mind." He laughed bitterly. "Perhaps I am losing my mind. Perhaps that would be a mercy." Ruth studied him, this man who was her father, this stranger who owned her. She saw the suffering in his face and felt nothing but cold satisfaction. Good, let him suffer. Let him feel even a fraction of what her mother had felt. "What happens now?" she asked. "You know who I am. I know who you are. What happens now, Master Carter?" The title was deliberate, a reminder of the power imbalance that no blood relation could erase. Elias flinched at it. "I don't know," he said again. I need time to think, to pray, to understand what God wants me to do." "God," Ruth repeated flatly. "You think God cares what you do? You who make your living buying and selling human souls? You who read scripture on Sunday and then watch your overseer whip people on Monday? Enough." Elias said sharply, some of his authority returning. "You forget your place." "No, sir," Ruth said, her voice steady. "I know exactly what my place is. I'm the ghost you can't bury. I'm the sin you can't wash away. I'm the 13-cent reminder that you're not the righteous man you pretend to be." She turned and left the study before he could respond, her hands shaking with anger and fear and something else she couldn't name. Behind her she heard Elias call her name once, but she didn't stop. That night, as Ruth lay on her pallet in the kitchen house, she heard screaming from the fields. Samuel Pierce, the overseer, was punishing someone for working too slowly. The screams went on for a long time, and nobody in the kitchen house said a word, because this was the sound of Rivermore, the constant backdrop to their lives. Ruth lay awake, listening, her grey eyes open in the darkness. In the main house, in his study, Elias Carter sat at his desk with his Bible open before him and a bottle of whiskey beside it, trying to find some verse that would tell him what to do, some passage that would explain how a man could destroy so many lives and still call himself Christian. He found nothing but silence and the distant echo of screams. The change in Elias Carter was subtle at first, but undeniable. The household staff noticed it immediately, though they spoke of it only in whispers, in the fleeting moments when they were sure no white ears could hear. The master had grown strange, distracted. He rose in the middle of the night and wandered the grounds. He stopped attending church services. He drank more and slept less, and the lines on his face deepened until he looked a decade older than his 48 years. Eleanor worried about her husband's health, but attributed it to business concerns. Cotton prices had been volatile that season, and she assumed the weight of financial management was taking its toll. She urged him to rest, to take meals regularly, to moderate his drinking. He nodded absently at her concerns and changed nothing. Ruth watched it all with careful attention. She had planted a seed in his mind, and now she watched it grow, its roots cracking the foundation of his carefully constructed righteousness. But she discovered something unexpected. She took no joy in his suffering. She had thought revenge would taste sweet, but instead it sat bitter on her tongue. 3 weeks after her arrival, Elias summoned Ruth to his study again. This time, several other people were present. Samuel Pierce, the overseer, a legal clerk from town, and Bessie. Ruth entered warily, her heart pounding. "Close the door," Elias instructed. Ruth obeyed, standing near the doorway while the others arranged themselves around the room. Pierce leaned against the bookshelf, his arms crossed, and a suspicious look on his face. The clerk sat at Elias's desk with paper and pen. Bessie stood near the window, her expression carefully neutral. "I'm making some changes to how Rivermore operates," Elias announced. His voice was steady, but Ruth could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the edge of his desk. "Effective immediately, the practice of physical punishment is to be reduced. Pierce, you will no longer use the whip without my direct authorization." Pierce straightened immediately, his face darkening. "Sir, with respect, that's how we maintain discipline. These people need to know there are consequences." "I am aware of what you believe they need," Elias interrupted coldly. "My mind is made up. You will find other methods." "Other methods," Pierce repeated incredulously. "Like what, sir? Asking them politely to work harder?" "Incentives," Elias said. "Extra rations for those who meet their quotas. A rest day once a month. Small wages that they can save toward eventual—" He paused, the next word clearly difficult. "Eventual manumission." The room went utterly silent. Even Bessie, who had maintained her composure through decades of slavery, looked shocked. Manumission, freedom. The word was practically blasphemy in a place like Rivermore. Pierce found his voice first. "Mr. Carter, have you lost your mind? Wages, freedom. This is Alabama, not Massachusetts. What you're suggesting would destroy the entire system. Every planter in the county would—" "I don't care what every planter in the county thinks," Elias snapped. "This is my plantation. These are my decisions. These are your assets. Pierce countered. Property. That's what they are under the law, whether you like it or not. And what you're proposing is economic suicide. Word gets out that you're paying slaves and talking about freedom, and you'll have runaways from every plantation within 50 miles trying to reach here. You'll have other owners demanding explanations, calling you an abolitionist sympathizer. Then let them call me what they want, Elias said, though Ruth could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. He wasn't prepared for the practical realities of his sudden moral awakening. The clerk spoke up for the first time, his voice careful and measured. "Mr. Carter, I should inform you that what you're proposing may have legal complications. The state of Alabama has strict regulations about the treatment of enslaved people. Provisions that are too generous could be seen as encouraging insurrection. And manumission requires extensive documentation and, in most cases, removal of the freed person from the state." Elias's face paled. He hadn't thought this through, Ruth realized. He had made his decision in an emotional moment, driven by guilt, without considering the web of laws and social structures that made such changes nearly impossible. "Then we'll work within the law," Elias said weakly. "Whatever is legal, we'll do." Pierce shook his head in disgust. "This is about her, isn't it?" He jerked his chin toward Ruth. "Ever since you brought that girl here, you've been acting strange. What hold does she have over you?" The room went deathly quiet. Ruth felt every eye turned toward her, felt the weight of the question hanging in the air. Bessie's eyes were wide with warning, silently begging Ruth to say nothing. "That's none of your concern," Elias said sharply. "You're dismissed, Pierce. All of you, except Ruth." Pierce's jaw clenched. He shot Ruth a look of pure hatred before stalking from the room. The clerk gathered his papers hurriedly and left. Bessie paused at the door, catching Ruth's eye one more time with that same warning expression before following the men out. Alone with Elias again, Ruth waited. He sat down heavily in his chair, looking exhausted. "I'm trying," he said quietly. "I'm trying to make things right." "You can't," Ruth said simply. "What's done is done. You can't bring my mother back. You can't give me back the years I spent being sold and beaten and worked like an animal. You can't make up for the hundreds of people you've owned and destroyed. Then what do you want from me?" Elias demanded, his voice rising with frustration and desperation. "Tell me what you want, and I'll do it." Ruth considered the question. What did she want? She had thought she wanted to see him suffer, to force him to acknowledge his sins. But now, watching him destroy himself with guilt, she found the victory hollow. "I want you to free them," she said finally. "All of them, every single person you own. Give them their freedom and let them go." Elias laughed bitterly. "You heard the clerk. It's nearly impossible legally, and even if I could navigate the laws, where would they go? How would they survive? Most have no education, no money, no means of supporting themselves. I would be sending them to starve." "That's what you tell yourself," Ruth said, "that you're protecting them by enslaving them. That's how every master justifies it. But the truth is, you're protecting yourself, your wealth, your comfort, your position in society." "And what about Eleanor?" Elias asked quietly. "She's dying, Ruth. Slowly, painfully dying. The doctors say she has perhaps a year, maybe less. How do I tell her that I'm destroying everything we built together? How do I explain why?" "You tell her the truth," Ruth said, "that you built it on sin, that every brick of this house, every thread of silk in her dresses, every bite of food on her table was purchased with human suffering. You tell her that you fathered a child with an enslaved woman and sold that woman to her death. You tell her the truth, and you bear the consequences." Elias's face crumpled. I can't do that to her, not now when she's so weak." "Then you're not really sorry," Ruth said coldly. "You're just uncomfortable. You want absolution without sacrifice. You want to feel better without actually changing anything." She turned to leave, But Elias's voice stopped her. "Wait, please." He stood, moving around the desk toward her. "I am trying. I know it's not enough. I know it can never be enough, but I am trying. Give me time. Let me figure out how to do this properly, how to free people without destroying them in the process." Ruth studied his face, seeing genuine anguish there. But she also saw weakness, the fundamental inability to give up the power and privilege he had spent a lifetime accumulating. "Time," she repeated. "Time is what my mother didn't have. Time is what the people in your fields don't have, breaking their backs for your profit." "How much time, Master Carter? How much time before your guilt translates into action?" "I don't know," Elias admitted. "But I swear to you, I will find a way. I will make changes, real changes. Just give me time to do it right." Ruth nodded slowly. She didn't believe him. Not really. But she also recognized that pushing too hard might break him entirely, and a broken master was more dangerous than a guilty one. "I'll wait," she said, "but not forever. And while I wait, I'll be watching. Every decision you make, every enslaved person you punish or sell or work to death, I'll be watching. And I'll make sure you see my face, my mother's face, every time." She left before he could respond. Outside the study, she found Bessie waiting in the hallway, her face tight with worry. "Child, what are you doing?" Bessie whispered urgently. "You're playing a dangerous game with that man. He may be feeling guilty now, but guilt can turn to anger quick as lightning. And an angry master is a deadly master." "I know," Ruth said, "but I have to try. For my mother. For all of us." Bessie shook her head. "Your mother would want you alive, child, not martyred for a cause that can't be won." But Ruth wasn't so sure. In her last days, as fever consumed her, Lydia had spoken of justice, of reckoning, of making those who profited from slavery pay for their sins. Ruth was her instrument, her weapon sent back to pierce the heart of the man who had destroyed her. That night, Rivermore seemed to hold its breath. In the main house, Eleanor Carter slept fitfully, coughing in her sleep, unaware that her carefully ordered world was crumbling. In the quarters, the enslaved people whispered about the master's strange new rules, daring to hope that perhaps things might improve, while the more cynical among them warned that a master's conscience was as changeable as the weather. In the smokehouse, Samuel Pierce sharpened his knives, his face dark with rage. He had built his life on the power to inflict pain, and now that power was being stripped away. He blamed the girl, the light-skinned stranger who had somehow bewitched his employer. Something would have to be done about her. And in his study, Elias Carter sat alone with his whiskey and his ledgers, trying to calculate a math that had no solution. How many acres could he sell to fund manumissions? How many people could he free before bankruptcy took the rest? How did a man dismantle the system that made him wealthy without destroying everyone who depended on that wealth, himself included? There were no answers. Only the numbers on the page, the red ink spreading like blood. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late September, carried by a rider who had traveled from Mobile. Elias accepted it with hands that trembled slightly, recognizing the seal of Judge Harold Whitmore, one of the most powerful men in Alabama's legal system and an old friend of his father. Eleanor was napping upstairs, and Ruth was in the kitchen preparing lunch, so Elias took the letter to his study and opened it in private. The contents were worse than he had feared. Word of his proposed changes at Rivermore had spread through the county with remarkable speed, carried by Samuel Pierce, who had apparently visited several neighboring plantations to express his concerns about his employer's mental state. Now, Judge Whitmore was writing to warn Elias that he was attracting dangerous attention. "Your recent actions suggest either a crisis of faith or an abandonment of reason," the judge wrote in his precise script. "You must understand that the social order of our region depends upon consistency in the treatment of enslaved populations. When one plantation owner begins speaking of wages and manumission, it creates unrest on every plantation around him. I urge you, as a friend of your late father, to reconsider these dangerous notions before they destroy you and potentially incite violence across the county. The letter went on to detail specific concerns, reports that Elias had stopped attending church, that he was drinking heavily, that he had taken a particular interest in one enslaved girl that had raised eyebrows. The implication was clear without being stated directly. If Elias continued down this path, he would find himself socially ostracized, his business connections severed, possibly even investigated for promoting abolitionist sympathies. Elias set the letter down with shaking hands. He had known there would be consequences to his actions, but the speed and coordination of the response shocked him. His neighbors were already moving against him, protecting their investments and their way of life. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, expecting Bessie or one of the house servants. Instead, Ruth entered, carrying a tray with his lunch. She set it on his desk, her movements efficient and practiced, but her grey eyes were watchful. "You received a letter," she observed. It wasn't a question. Elias gestured wearily at the paper. "From Judge Whitmore. It seems my conscience has become a matter of public concern. What will you do?" The question was direct, challenging. Elias met her gaze and saw his own face reflected back at him, waiting to see if his resolve would crumble under pressure. "I don't know," he admitted. "They're threatening everything. My business, my reputation, my place in society. If I continue, I'll be ruined." "And if you stop," Ruth asked quietly, "if you go back to the way things were, what then?" "Then nothing changes," Elias said. "I continue profiting from slavery. The people in the fields continue suffering, and you—" He stopped, unable to finish the thought. "And I continue being your property," Ruth finished for him. "Your 13-cent reminder of sin. Is that what you want?" Before Elias could answer, the door burst open. Samuel Pierce stood in the doorway, his face flushed with anger and alcohol. He swayed slightly, and Elias realized the overseer was drunk, though it was barely noon. "There you are," Pierce slurred, pointing at Ruth, "the little witch who's destroyed this place." "Pierce, get out," Elias ordered, standing. "You're drunk." "Damn right I'm drunk," Pierce snarled, "because I can see what's happening here even if you can't. This girl has bewitched you somehow. Made you forget everything your father taught you about running a plantation, made you soft." "I said get out," Elias repeated, his voice harder now, but Pierce ignored him, advancing toward Ruth. Light-skinned girl shows up out of nowhere, and suddenly the master's conscience starts troubling him. "Why is that? What's so special about this one that she can turn your head?" Ruth stood perfectly still, her face expressionless, but Elias could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands clenched at her sides. "Because she's my daughter," Elias said. The words were out before he could stop them, ringing in the sudden silence like a gunshot. Pierce stopped mid-step, his mouth hanging open. Ruth's eyes went wide with shock, not at the truth which she had known, but at hearing him say it aloud. "You're—" "What?" Pierce whispered. Elias felt something break inside him, some dam that had been holding back the truth for weeks. "My daughter. Her mother was Lydia, a field hand I sold to Louisiana 7 years ago. I didn't know Lydia was pregnant when I sold her. I didn't know until Ruth appeared at that auction, and I saw my own face looking back at me." Pierce's expression cycled through shock, disgust, and finally a kind of triumph. "So that's it? That's why you're trying to destroy everything, out of guilt over some bastard child?" He laughed harshly. "Your neighbors are going to love this. Judge Whitmore especially. Wait until they hear—" "If you repeat what you heard here, I'll kill you," Elias said quietly. The absolute certainty in his voice made Pierce go pale. "You can't threaten me," Pierce blustered, but his confidence was shaken. "I'm not threatening," Elias said. "I'm stating fact. You'll leave this house immediately. Your employment is terminated. I want you off my land by nightfall." Pierce's face darkened to purple. You're making a mistake, Carter. A big mistake. Without me, this plantation will fall apart. Those slaves need a firm hand. Then I'll find someone with a gentler one, Elias replied. Get out, now. Pierce glared at them both for a long moment, his mind clearly calculating angles, weighing his options. Finally, he turned and stormed from the room, slamming the door behind him so hard the windows rattled. Alone again with Ruth, Elias sat down heavily. He felt exhausted, drained by the admission he had made, but also strangely relieved, as if some poisonous thing had been lanced. Why did you tell him? Ruth asked softly. Because it was true, Elias said. Because I'm tired of hiding it. Because, he looked up at her, his grey eyes meeting hers, because you deserve to be acknowledged, not as property, as my child. Ruth's expression was unreadable. Acknowledging me changes nothing. I'm still enslaved, still owned. You just gave Pierce ammunition to destroy us both. I know, Elias said, but perhaps destruction is what we deserve. Perhaps that's the only way anything can really change. He pulled out a sheet of paper and began writing. Ruth watched silently as his pen moved across the page, forming words she couldn't read, but whose significance she could guess. What is that? She asked when he finished. Your manumission papers, Elias said. It will take time to process them legally, weeks or maybe months, but this begins the process. You'll be free, Ruth. That's the one thing I can do that can't be undone. Ruth stared at the document, her breath catching. Freedom. The word was almost meaningless after a lifetime of slavery, a concept too large to comprehend. What about the others? One step at a time, Elias said. I'll free as many as I can, as quickly as I can. But you first. You're my daughter. You deserve that much at least. Ruth nodded slowly, but her expression remained troubled. Freedom papers won't protect me from Pierce, or from the people who'll come when he spreads the truth about us. You've made us both targets. I know, Elias admitted. But for once in my life, I'm choosing to do the right thing, consequences be damned. They sat in silence for a moment, both understanding that something irrevocable had just occurred. The secret was out. The careful balance of power and pretense was shattered. Everything would change now, for better or worse. Downstairs, they could hear sounds of commotion, raised voices, the slam of doors. Pierce was making good on his promise to leave, but not quietly. He was telling everyone who would listen about the master's confession, planting seeds of scandal that would grow into the county's most shocking gossip within hours. By evening, the damage was done. 3 of Rivermore's white overseers had quit in solidarity with Pierce. 2 suppliers had sent messages cancelling their contracts, and a delegation of concerned neighbors had announced they would be visiting the next day to discuss Mr. Carter's mental health and the proper management of his affairs. Eleanor, finally informed of the chaos, confronted Elias in their bedroom that night. She was weak from her illness, her face pale and drawn, but her eyes flashed with anger. "Is it true?" she demanded. "What Pierce is saying about you and that girl?" Elias stood before his wife of 26 years and found he could not lie anymore. "Yes, it's true. Ruth is my daughter. Her mother was Lydia, the woman I sold in 1838. Eleanor swayed, gripping the bedpost for support. "You gave me your word. When I was ill, when I couldn't, you promised you would be faithful." "I broke that promise," Elias said. "I am sorry, Eleanor. Sorrier than I can express." "Sorry," she repeated bitterly. "You've destroyed us, our reputation, our standing, everything. And for what? For guilt over some slave woman who probably lied about the child being yours anyway." "She didn't lie," Elias said quietly. "Ruth looks exactly like me. Exactly like my sister Margaret did at that age. There's no doubt." Eleanor laughed, a harsh sound with no humor in it. "So, what now? You're going to free her? Acknowledge her publicly as your daughter? Have her inherit alongside our legitimate sons?" "I've already begun the manumission process," Elias admitted. And yes, if possible, I'd like to provide for her future. You're insane, Eleanor said flatly. You've lost your mind, and now you're going to drag us all down with you. She moved toward the door, her steps unsteady. I'm writing to our sons. They need to know what's happening here. Perhaps they can have you declared incompetent before you destroy everything their grandfather built. She left, and Elias didn't try to stop her. He sat alone in the bedroom he had shared with his wife for more than 2 decades, listening to her cough in the room where she had retreated. He wondered if she would ever speak to him again, wondered if it mattered. In the kitchen house, Ruth lay awake, hearing the sounds of Rivermoor at night. People were frightened, she could sense it. Change was coming, violent and unstoppable, and no one knew if they would survive it. She thought of her mother, dead in Louisiana, and wondered if Lydia would be proud of what Ruth had accomplished, forcing the truth into the light, or horrified at the destruction it might cause. Freedom papers were being prepared, but freedom itself was still a distant dream. And between Ruth and that dream lay a gauntlet of angry men, broken social contracts, and a society determined to defend slavery at any cost. The clock struck midnight. Somewhere in the darkness, Samuel Pierce sat in a cheap boarding house in town, composing letters to every influential person he knew, detailing his former employer's confession and promising more damaging revelations to come. He smiled as he wrote, imagining the scandal that would engulf Rivermoor. Elias Carter had humiliated him, destroyed his livelihood. Now Pierce would return the favor 100-fold. The storm was gathering, and when it broke, it would wash away everything in its path. The delegation arrived at noon the next day. 5 men on horseback, all of them prominent plantation owners from neighboring properties. Judge Whitmore led them, his face stern and disapproving. They tied their horses to the hitching post and approached the main house in grim silence, like pallbearers at a funeral. Elias received them in the parlor, standing rather than sitting, refusing to show weakness. Eleanor remained upstairs, too ill or too angry to appear. Through the window, Elias could see the enslaved people in the yard had stopped their work to watch, sensing that something important was happening. "Gentlemen," Elias greeted them coolly, "to what do I owe this visit?" Judge Whitmore didn't waste time on pleasantries. "We've come to discuss your recent conduct, Elias, specifically the disturbing reports we've received from Samuel Pierce and others regarding your treatment of your property and your stated intentions to undermine the institution that supports us all." "Pierce is a drunken liar," Elias said. "Is he?" The judge raised an eyebrow. "Then you deny that you've fathered a child with an enslaved woman, that you've begun manumission proceedings for this child, that you've made statements about paying wages and granting freedom to your workforce." Elias hesitated, seeing the trap. If he denied it, he maintained his reputation, but betrayed Ruth and his newfound convictions. If he confirmed it, he gave them ammunition to destroy him. "The truth is more complicated than Pierce presented it," Elias said carefully. "We're not here to discuss complications," interrupted Colonel Marcus Reed, owner of the largest plantation in the county. "We're here because your actions threaten the stability of the entire region. Already, we're hearing reports of unrest on other plantations, enslaved people asking questions, demanding better treatment, citing Rivermoor as an example. Do you understand what you've done? You've given them hope, and hope is the most dangerous thing you can give property." "They're not property," Elias said quietly. "They're people." The silence that followed was absolute and terrible. The 5 men stared at him as if he had blasphemed in church. "Good God," Judge Whitmore whispered. "Pierce didn't exaggerate. You've truly lost your mind." "Or found it," Elias replied. "Perhaps for the first time in my life I'm seeing clearly. What we do here, what we've all built our fortunes on, it's evil, fundamental, irredeemable evil, and I can no longer participate in it." Colonel Reed's face darkened. "That's abolitionist talk, Carter. Dangerous, treasonous abolitionist talk. In some places, you could be hanged for saying such things." "Then hang me," Elias said. his voice steady despite the fear coiling in his gut. "But I won't change my position. I'm freeing the people I've enslaved, starting with my daughter." "Your bastard," Judge Whitmore corrected coldly. "The product of your fornication with your property. You think acknowledging such a creature will somehow redeem you? It will only destroy what remains of your reputation." "My reputation is already destroyed," Elias said. "You've seen to that by coming here today. By tomorrow, everyone in the county will know about this visit and speculate on its purpose. So let them know the truth. Yes, I fathered a child with a woman I owned. Yes, I sold that woman to Louisiana where she died. Yes, I'm now attempting to make amends by freeing her daughter and as many others as I can legally manage. Let them judge me for it. I judge myself far more harshly." The 5 men exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Finally, Judge Whitmore spoke again, his voice harder now. "We had hoped reason would prevail, but I see you're determined to destroy yourself. Very well. Let me be clear about the consequences. As of today, you are socially ostracized. No respectable family will receive you. Your business contracts will be cancelled. Your loans will be called in. And if you persist in this madness of freeing your slaves, we will petition the state legislature to have your property seized on grounds of mental incompetence and threat to public order." "You can't do that," Elias said, though his voice lacked conviction. "We can, and we will," Colonel Reed assured him. "We have lawyers and judges and politicians in our pockets." "You may think you're being noble, Carter, but you're actually being incredibly stupid. You cannot fight the entire South." "Then I'll fight until I lose," Elias said. The men rose to leave, their visit clearly over. But Judge Whitmore paused at the door, his hand on the frame, and looked back. "Your father would be ashamed of you," he said quietly. "James Carter built Rivermore from nothing, established your family's name and fortune. And you're throwing it all away for what? Guilt? Sentimentality? A mulatto bastard who should have been sold away years ago?" "My father," Elias said softly, "built everything on suffering and called it success. If he would be ashamed of me now, then perhaps I'm finally doing something right." The judge shook his head in disgust and left. The other men followed, mounting their horses and riding away in a cloud of dust. Elias watched them go, feeling the weight of what he had just done settle on his shoulders like a physical burden. In the kitchen house, Ruth had listened to everything through the open window. Bessie stood beside her, both women silent as the confrontation unfolded. When the men left, Bessie finally spoke. "They're going to destroy him," she said, "and when they're done with him, they'll come for you. You should run, child, tonight. I can get you food and a little money. Head north while you still can." But Ruth shook her head. "I can't run. Not now. He's doing this because of me, because of what I made him see. If I run, it makes it all meaningless." "Better meaningless than dead," Bessie said bluntly. "These men don't play games, Ruth. They'll kill to protect what's theirs, and to them you represent everything they fear. Slaves who speak up, who demand recognition, who threaten the order they've built." "And let them fear," Ruth said, surprised by the steel in her own voice. "Let them see that their order is crumbling, that their comfortable sins are catching up with them." Over the following weeks, the predictions came true. Elias's creditors called in his loans. His suppliers refused to sell to him. Even the doctor who had been treating Eleanor stopped making house calls. The plantation began to hemorrhage money, as no buyers would purchase Rivermore's cotton crop, no matter how good the quality. Eleanor's health deteriorated rapidly. She refused to see her husband, speaking to him only through intermediaries. Their sons wrote angry letters, demanding explanations and threatening legal action. The social isolation was complete. Invitations stopped coming. Old friends crossed the street to avoid greeting him. Even the minister from their church sent word that Elias was no longer welcome at services. Through it all, Elias continued working on manumission papers. He sold pieces of land at terrible prices to fund the legal fees. He spent hours with lawyers, navigating the complex web of Alabama's laws regarding the freeing of enslaved people. The process was deliberately difficult, designed to discourage exactly what he was attempting. Ruth's papers came through first, on a cold November morning. Elias called her to his study and handed her the document with an expression of triumph mixed with exhaustion. "You're free," he said simply. "Legally, officially free. No one can own you anymore." Ruth took the paper with trembling hands, staring at the official seal and signatures. Freedom. The concept still felt unreal, like trying to hold water. "What do I do now?" "Whatever you want," Elias said, "though I'd recommend leaving Alabama. The laws require freed slaves to leave the state within a year, and honestly, it's not safe for you here. I've arranged funds for travel north, Philadelphia perhaps, or New York, somewhere you can build a new life." "What about you?" Ruth asked. "What happens to you when I leave?" Elias smiled sadly. "I face the consequences of my actions. I continue freeing people as I can, until the courts or my creditors force me to stop, and I live with what I've done, trying to balance the scales, even though I know they can never truly be balanced." Ruth studied him, this broken man who was her father. He had aged years in the past months. His hair had gone almost entirely grey, his face was gaunt from poor sleep and irregular meals, his hands shook from drinking too much. He was destroying himself in atonement, piece by piece. "Come with me," she said impulsively. "Come north, start over, leave all this behind." But Elias shook his head. "I can't abandon Eleanor, not while she's dying. And someone needs to see this through, to free as many people as possible before Rivermore falls. That's my penance, to tear down everything I built, brick by brick." They were interrupted by a commotion outside. Shouts, the sound of breaking glass, the thunder of many horses. Elias rushed to the window and felt his blood run cold. A mob had arrived, at least 30 men, some on horseback, others on foot, many carrying torches despite the midday sun. They spread across the front lawn like a plague, their faces twisted with anger and righteous fury. "Go!" Elias ordered Ruth urgently. "Out the back! Find Bessie and run! Take your papers and go now!" But it was too late. The front door burst open, splintering off its hinges. Men poured into the house, tracking mud and violence across Eleanor's carefully maintained floors. They grabbed Elias roughly, dragging him toward the door even as he struggled. "You thought you could defy us?" Colonel Reed snarled, his face inches from Elias's. "You thought you could undermine everything we've built and we'd just let you? You're a traitor, Carter, a traitor to your race and your class." They hauled him outside. Ruth tried to follow, but hands grabbed her, holding her back. Through the window, she saw them drag Elias toward the old sycamore tree where she had first been sold. Someone had thrown a rope over the strongest branch. The symbolism was deliberate and cruel. "No!" Ruth screamed, fighting against the hands that held her. "Stop, please!" But the mob was beyond reason. They were defending their world, their property rights, their God-given superiority. Elias Carter had challenged all of that, and he would pay the price. They forced a noose over Elias's head. He didn't beg or plead. He looked toward the house one last time, his grey eyes finding Ruth's through the window, and in that moment she saw not a master, not a sinner, not even really her father. She saw a man who had finally, too late, understood the weight of his sins. "For Lydia," Elias called out, his voice strong despite the rope around his neck. "For Ruth, for all of them. May God forgive us for what we've done." The rope tightened. Ruth turned away, unable to watch, but she heard the sounds, the creak of rope, the snap of the branch taking weight, the roar of the mob's approval. When she finally looked again, Elias Carter hung from the sycamore tree, his body swaying gently in the November wind. The mob dispersed quickly, their message delivered. By nightfall, word would spread across the county. This is what happens to those who betray their own kind. Ruth stood at the window, her freedom papers clutched in her hand, tears streaming down her face. She had wanted justice, had wanted him to pay for what he did to her mother, but not like this. Never like this. Bessie appeared at her side, wrapping an arm around Ruth's shaking shoulders. "We have to go, child, right now, before they come back for you." Ruth nodded numbly. She took one last look at the house, at the plantation that had been built on the broken backs of her people, at the tree where her father now hung, paying the ultimate price for his brief moment of conscience. Then she turned away and followed Bessie out the back door, clutching her freedom papers like a lifeline. Eleanor Carter died 3 days later, never having seen her husband's body or learned the full details of his death. Their sons arrived to find Rivermore in chaos, their father dead, their inheritance tangled in legal battles, and a scandal that would haunt their family name for generations. The enslaved people of Rivermore were sold at auction to pay Elias's debts, dispersed to plantations across the South. The manumission papers he had been working on were destroyed by his sons, deemed evidence of mental incompetence. Only Ruth's papers survived, already filed and sealed with the court. She made it to Philadelphia by winter, traveling on foot and by wagon, always moving north, always carrying those papers that proclaimed her legally free. She found work in a boarding house, saved her money, and eventually opened a small school for freed blacks and escaped slaves. She never married, never spoke of her father or Rivermore to anyone, but every year on the anniversary of that November day, she would take out the old papers and read them, remembering a man who had discovered his conscience too late to save himself, but perhaps just in time to save his soul. Years later, after the Civil War had torn the South apart and rebuilt it, Ruth returned to Alabama. Rivermore had been abandoned, the main house burned, the fields gone to seed. But the sycamore tree still stood, ancient and gnarled, its branches spreading wide like judgment. Ruth stood beneath it, an old woman now, and said a prayer. Not for her father, though perhaps he was included, but for all of them. For Lydia and Elias, for the 200 souls who had labored here, for the thousands more across the South who had suffered under the weight of slavery's sin. "We survived," she said to the wind. "We survived, and we remember, and that's the only justice we'll ever get." She placed a small stone at the base of the tree, a marker that would mean nothing to anyone else but everything to her. Then she walked away, leaving Rivermore to its ghosts and its memories, carrying her freedom north one more time. The plantation crumbled into ruins over the decades, reclaimed by forest and time. But the story lived on, passed down in whispers and warnings. The tale of Elias Carter, who bought his own daughter for 13 cents and paid for his sins with his life. Some called it justice. Some called it tragedy. History called it what it was, the brutal arithmetic of slavery, where every sin came with a price, and payment was always extracted in blood and tears and broken lives. And in the deep places where memory lives, where the dead speak to the living and the past refuses to stay buried, the scales finally balanced. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but balanced nonetheless. The price of blood paid in silver and shame.